Awesome. Perfect. Okay, so we're going to go live here in 5, 4, 3, 2. All right, we are live. Hello and welcome everyone to another Chat and Learn here with Power to Fly. My name is Mariella Marie, and as always, super excited to roll into this next hour with you all. We've got lots of people joining this conversation, so clearly this is something that you all are really interested in. But before we get kicked off, I just want to go over some quick housekeeping rules and guidelines so that we can all feel comfortable and confident in this next hour. I like to start off by saying you can be doing anything else with your time, but you're deciding to be with us for the hour, whether you're here live or you're rewatching, and we just want to say thank you so much for participating. Now, if you're here live with us, you can participate in a number of ways. You can turn on your cameras if you feel called to do so. I know that video fatigue is real, so no pressure, no shame. If you don't want to, please just feel comfortable just listening in and using the chat box instead. But I do like to extend that invitation and just in case people need that extra invite, turn your cameras on. I believe in visibility. I want to make sure that different voices are being heard, different perspectives are being shared in this next hour. So put your virtual backgrounds on if your place is a mess, or show your mess and show up as your full self. There's no judging here. So you can participate that way. You can also participate by dropping in the chat box. You can drop any questions, any reflections, any tips and tricks of your own. I really want to use this opportunity for you all to start to build meaningful relationships in the chat box. And if you see some people who are already dropping their preferred ways of connecting, it's because before we started to record, I was inviting folks to drop their preferred ways of connecting in the chat box so that you all can start to network and reach out to each other. As I know this is a really chewy topic and we can't cover it all in an hour. So we really want to make sure that you are, extending your support outside of this conversation. Now, if anyone has any private information, anonymous information, any sensitive information, and you prefer to be kept anonymous, you can find me in the chat box under Mariella Marie. You can write to me privately there, and I will raise your question or your reflection and keep you anonymous. And if anyone wants to hop off mute at any point in this conversation, you can just cue me that you'd like to hop off by raising your emoji hand. Or you can write to me privately or in the public chat and let me know you'd like permission to hop off mute. And if we have time, I will give you permission to hop off mute. But we've got a lot to cover today, so I just wanted to make sure that we cover all bases here. And if you signed up for this conversation, be looking out for a rewatch email. And that rewatch email will include a link to this recorded chat. It will also include any links to resources that our guest speaker might mention throughout the conversation so that you can have easy access there. And again, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. We would love for you to follow Power to Fly on socials and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can keep up with all the great chats we've got in store for you this year. I can't believe that January is almost over. Can you all believe it? All right, so if this is your first chat that you're joining and I'm moderating, I'll just take a couple of seconds to introduce myself before I pass the mic to our guest speaker. So again, my name is Mariella Marie. I'm originally from Los Angeles, California, and I currently live in Patagonia and San Martin de los Andes, the original lands of the Mapuche people. And I really love speaking about the importance of emotional intelligence at home, at work, and at play. So I might bring some of my reflections to that note throughout this conversation. If anyone else is interested in philosophizing or sharing actionable tips on how we can practice emotional intelligence, please join the conversation. You can drop that in the chat. Otherwise, you can support the project that I'm working on that is called the Positive Force Team. I see that we already got Ro here dropping up the Positive Force Team's link in the chat box. Thank you so much. So you can follow the Positive Force Team. You can go to thepositiveforceteam.org, or you can sign up for our newsletter and keep up with all the great things that we're working on there. I'm also happy to connect on LinkedIn in just a few moments. I'll be dropping my LinkedIn in the chat box as well. And if you haven't already, I would invite you all to start to drop your preferred ways of connecting in the chat box. Again, if you're just joining, we really want you to use this opportunity to network and build meaningful relationships with people who are, interested in the same topics that you are. So today, we're speaking about a really chewy topic, and that gives you an invitation to connect with like-minded folks here. So use the chat box, drop your preferred ways of connecting. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to our guest speaker, Julia. Julia, let us know a little bit about yourself, how you came to learn about Power to Fly, and what you're excited to share today. Thank you for being here, by the way.
Thank you, Mariella Marie, best moderator ever, keeping the energy up in this virtual environment. I'm loving it. Yeah, so I have been a fan of Power to Fly for a while and found out about the organization through Instagram, of all places. Although I don't consider myself an Instagram expert, you all have a really incredible community and following. So that's how we met each other. I am a self-described recovering perfectionist, recovering, not recovered. That's a journey that I'm constantly on. So any other recovering perfectionists, let me know in the chat. I'm the founder of, oh, we got some recovering perfectionists in here too. I'm the founder of the Authenticity Guide, which is a coaching company focused on authenticity and human connection at work and in life. I work with individuals, I work with companies. I've got some really incredible coaches who work under my umbrella, and I get to do awesome things like give presentations on imposter syndrome to people like you. And I live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So hello to all of my neighbors in North Carolina here.
Yes, I see we've got a lot of folks who are representing North Carolina in the chat, and I just want to shout out where folks are calling from so that, as we roll into your presentation and the question and answer session, you can keep in mind that, we are a pretty global community here. So it looks like we got San Antonio, Texas representing, we've got Los Angeles representing, Buenos Aires, Patagonia also, we've got London, we've got Mexico, Tennessee, we've got Texas again, Calgary, we got Vancouver, BC, St. Louis, New York City, Chicago, scrolling up higher, we got the Philippines representing, Seattle, Los Angeles, Austin, Texas, North Carolina, San Francisco, Boston, Vancouver, Boston again, Arizona, wow. Charlotte, North Carolina. Great. So we've got lots of people calling from different places today in the world. I really appreciate you all dropping in the chat already. That lets me know that you all are paying attention. I know that we are like queens and kings at multitasking, so I'm going to invite everyone to be present with us so that we can participate. And just to set the stage, Julia, I would love for you to cover the principal themes for today's conversation before we roll into your presentation.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about three major things. We're going to talk about what imposter syndrome is. We're going to get really clear on a definition of it, and we're going to have a conversation around that. We're going to talk about how to understand how this shows up for you, because it's different for everyone, right? We all have our own kind of brands of imposter syndrome and when and where it shows up. And then probably the piece that most people get excited about is tips and tricks to overcome it. And so while you might not leave today banishing imposter syndrome forever, these are going to be tools to help improve its presence in your life. So that's going to be the goal of our talk today. And we're going to have lots of time for questions, I hope. So we'll get to hear from all of you.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. And I know I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I know you got a beautiful presentation to kick us off with. But can you just verbally shout out, how we can connect with you when we finish this conversation? Because I know that some folks are already eager to connect. We've got some folks who are dropping that they are also recovering perfectionists. And just in general, anyone who's experiencing imposter syndrome on whatever side of the spectrum, how can they follow you or connect with you?
Yes, so follow me on LinkedIn. My name is spelled right on my Zoom here. So follow me or connect with me, just add a little note so I know where we know each other from. You can also subscribe to my newsletter on my website. So those are the best ways to connect. Also, you can follow the Authenticity Guide on Instagram.
Awesome. So go ahead. I've made you the co-host. You can share your screen and just get us kicked off here. And I just want to also let folks know who are joining. If during this presentation you have any questions that come up, maybe you weren't able to submit a question previous to this chat, go ahead and drop those questions in the chat box, and I will keep those in mind. If we have time to get to them, I will raise them. So thank you so much, Julia, for putting this together. And please take us away.
Yes, thank you so much. All right, so let's get going. Let's dive in. We've only got 50 minutes here. So this is me. This is a little bit more of an intro of me. I always like to start with the human side. Yes, I run a company, but these are my mammals here. That's my dog Blueberry and my husband Steve. They're my loves, my life. So that's the most important part of me. I want to talk about the first time I experienced imposter syndrome, just because I think it's important to know that your speaker is someone who has experienced these feelings. The first time I experienced imposter syndrome, I didn't know what to call it. And that may be a really common experience for many of you. I was in a class called AP Physics, which is a class no one should have to take, in 11th grade. And I remember getting home and I sort of confessed. It was this confessional to my dad. And I said, Dad, someone has made a mistake. I'm in this class and I don't belong. but I'm hiding and I feel like I'm faking it. And as soon as the teacher finds out that I'm not smart enough to be in the classroom, he's going to kick me out and I'm going to be in trouble and I'm going to get detention forever. And my dad, who is a physician, a very accomplished physician who I've seen do procedures that are life-saving to individuals, he said to me, Julia, what you're experiencing has a name. It's called imposter syndrome. And I said, what? Other people have felt this way? No, I'm the first person to ever feel this way. And he said, no, this is a researched phenomenon. It's when capable, intelligent people feel like they're faking it. And would you believe me if I told you I feel like this every day before I'm supposed to do procedures on people? And so I fainted, I fell on the ground, I was shocked. I couldn't believe that someone who I considered so accomplished also had these feelings. But that was the first time that I had a name for this phenomenon that I would encounter pretty often in my adult life. And so I would like you to kind of pause and think about when the first time is that you experienced imposter syndrome, because I think if we have time at the end, it would be cool to hear some of those stories. So let's talk about a definition. Let's kind of level set on what this is that we're talking about. So imposter syndrome is a feeling of phoniness. It really makes us feel like we're phonies. We believe we're not intelligent, we're not capable, we're not creative, we're not any of these good things. But here's the key, that's why it's bolded. Despite evidence of high achievement, right? There's evidence of your success, but you are really good at discounting that. So while you might be highly motivated to achieve and to succeed, there's sort of this living in fear, this shroud of secrecy and shame that you're going to be exposed as a fraud, right? So that's what imposter syndrome is. Oftentimes, because it has the word syndrome in it, it's tempting to think that this is a disease, right? Maybe it's in the DSM, right? That big encyclopedia of mental and psychological disorders. It's not. It is actually a pretty well-documented normal feeling that 3/4 of human beings have. 3/4, that's a lot, at various points in our lives. Where does this phrase come from? So the seminal study on it, I'm a big geek for research, so I love to know where things come from. So the first time that the phrase the imposter phenomenon shows up is in this study from 1978 from Dr. Pauline Rose Clance and Suzanne Imes. They were the ones who sort of founded this phrase imposter phenomenon. Here's the interesting thing to note about this study. They studied this feeling of feeling like an imposter in an academic environment. So at Georgia State University, they studied this phenomenon only with women, right? So if you've taken a science class, you know that what happens when you study just one sample, your conclusions are about that one sample of people, not about any other group of people, right? So these were predominantly white, predominantly straight, and all women, right? So it makes sense, right? That when we hear imposter syndrome, we're often taught that this is a thing that only women experience or more women experience. In my experience and in consequent studies, that is actually not the case. This isn't a women's disease. It's just that when it was first studied, it was studied in women. I have to talk about this article that came out in HBR in February of last year. It got a ton of play. I loved this article. It was called Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome. And I think it's worth kind of reading this piece on the right. So the concept, whose development in the 70s, as you now know, excluded the effects of systemic racism, classism, xenophobia, and other biases, took a fairly universal feeling of discomfort, second guessing, and mild anxiety in the workplace and pathologized it, meaning created a disease-like thing around it, especially for women. And so they propose in this article that the answer to overcoming imposter syndrome is not to fix individuals, but to create an environment that fosters different leadership styles where we can see diverse leadership in our companies. So I love this article because I think it touches on something really important, which is that imposter syndrome can be a product of our environments, right? When we're in places where we do not see leaders or experts who look and sound like us, we are far more susceptible to think we don't belong or to feel like we have to prove something. Systemic racism and sexism is a crucial part of imposter syndrome. However, I want to add to this article that I actually think it's systemic and individual. So I think that there's work we can do on the systemic end with companies and representation of what leaders look like and sound like, what we consider professional, but also work that we need to do internally to understand our own feelings and overcome them. So I think it's a dual approach. So I'm a big fan of graphical representations of concepts. So I have a couple here for you about imposter syndrome. So you can see on the top left is the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is really interesting. It's when perceived ability is super, super high, but actual ability is quite low. And an interesting fact about the Dunning-Kruger effect is that Google searches for this phrase went up exponentially after the 2016 presidential election. Now, on the bottom right, you have imposter syndrome, where actual ability is quite high, but perceived ability or your sense of your own ability is quite low. This is another graphical representation of imposter syndrome, right? It's this sense that, oh God, everyone else knows everything. I know nothing, right? Has anyone had that feeling, right? You're in a room, everyone knows everything, I know nothing. The truth is, we all know kind of the same amount, it's just in different areas, right? So it feels like other people know everything and we know nothing, but we just know different things. I think it's always helpful to understand that really badass people have well-documented experiences with imposter syndrome. So if we were in a workshop, I would make you guess who said these things, but yeah, I'm telling you now. Albert Einstein famously said, the exaggerated esteem in which my life work is held makes me very ill at ease. I feel compelled to think of myself as an involuntary swindler. Einstein said that, right? Feeling like he was pulling one over on people. The second person who I love, who famously talked about imposter syndrome, is Maya Angelou. She said, I've written 11 books, but each time I think, oh, they're gonna find out, they're gonna find me out. I've run a game on everyone, they're gonna find me out, right? And so you're in good company if you've experienced these things. It is a well-documented phenomenon, and it is imposter syndrome. I want to talk about ways in which I see the phrase imposter syndrome being misused. And a lot of you had questions on this, so I think it's going to be important to tackle. I want to talk about the first distinction. The first one is a knowledge gap, right? So a lot of times people will come into something new and not know how to do the thing that they're expected to do. So a good example is I'm being promoted into a new role at a new company. I have no idea how to do what's expected of me. When you feel insecure and unsure of yourself, that's because of a knowledge gap. That's not imposter syndrome. A knowledge gap is a gap between what you're expected to know how to do and what you currently know how to do. Imposter syndrome, on the other hand, is you slip through the cracks and you're going to be found out, right? There isn't necessarily a knowledge gap. It's just the sense that you don't belong and you're going to be found out. Now, what you might be thinking is it possible to have both? Can you have a knowledge gap and imposter syndrome? The answer, yes. Great question. This is actually what I see most in my clients. They show up to a new job and they have a knowledge gap, but where imposter syndrome comes in is they doubt their ability to learn and make up for the gap, right? So you come into a new job and you say, everyone knows everything, I'm completely faking it, there are all these acronyms, I have no idea how to do my job, and I think I'm never gonna learn how to do it, and this is a permanent state, right? So where imposter syndrome comes in is you're discounting all of those historical times that you've tackled a knowledge gap, learned what you needed to learn, and succeeded. Imposter syndrome and the knowledge gap means you doubt your ability to overcome the knowledge gap. Okay, so that's the first way I see imposter syndrome being misused. The second way I see it being misused is conflating it for a lack of confidence. I think you saw from our definition, this sense of feeling like you're going to be found out is different from a lack of confidence. A lack of confidence can manifest as negative self-talk, feeling like you hate yourself, a low sense of self. Lack of confidence actually can be a symptom of imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome, if you have these feelings and they're pervasive enough, can cause low self-esteem, but they're not the same thing. How do we cope? These feelings are so unpleasant, right? I think the worst part about imposter syndrome is the sense that it's a secret, that we're alone with it, that we're carrying around this little shame in our heart that I'm faking it. Someone's going to find me out. So how do we cope? It's human nature to cope. There's a couple major ways to cope. And I saw a question, what are the different types of imposter syndrome? Well, there's only one type of imposter syndrome that we've been talking about. I think the question maybe is, how do we cope? How do we see manifestations of coping with imposter syndrome? There's a couple of ways. These might sound familiar to you. One of them is work harder, right? So because I feel like a fraud, I'm going to burn the midnight oil. I'm going to study way harder than I need to for that test. I'm going to over prepare for this presentation to compensate and make up for the fact that I feel like I don't belong. I'm like, I'm a fraud. The second one is excess charm and compensatory behavior, right? So the way this might look is if you're feeling imposter syndrome at work, you might come to learn what your boss's favorite sports team is, what all of the first and middle names of his children are, and what their birthdays are. I'm not speaking from experience. Just kidding, I am. These are all things that I'm guilty of, right? I'm totally guilty of the work harder and the excess charm and compensatory behavior, right? So these are ways that we make ourselves feel better when we feel like a fraud. So we shore up against those feelings. These mechanisms are totally normal and totally universal. So if you find yourself experiencing feelings of imposter syndrome, working harder, trying to be charming, those are really normal human ways of coping. Why does this happen? Like, what is the evolutionary reason why this happens? Yes, well, I wish I had a specific and data-driven answer, but what I can share with you is that like most psychological phenomenons, it is a mixture of two things: nature, the personality traits you're born with, right? Many firstborns have perfectionist tendencies, focus on high achievement, and that good old other thing, nurture, right? So what was the situation in your nuclear family growing up? Was there a heavy focus on achievement? A critical thing here is many people will say, my family just wanted me to be happy. And to that I say, well, a focus on achievement in a nuclear family isn't always conscious. Many times it's unconscious or subconscious, or it's the messaging that you're receiving if it isn't clear and literal. So these are the two combination of factors why imposter syndrome shows up. We had a question on burnout and imposter syndrome, which I really thought was such a great question given the environment that we're in now. So many of us are burned out. So many of us are quitting or scaling back. What does burnout have to do with imposter syndrome? So there have been actually a lot of studies on this. The studies are particularly related to physician burnout and imposter syndrome. And these studies have found that burnout can reinforce feelings of imposter syndrome. So they can mutually enforce each other, particularly when the feeling is everyone else seems to be doing so fine and coping really well. Why am I doing so badly? So burnout and imposter syndrome can reinforce each other. That said, it's important to note that burnout is also correlated with an increase in work errors. So some might say burnout actually makes you more of an imposter, especially if you hide those errors. So that's the way that relationship works. So I'm going to pause here, Mariella Marie, and take questions before we get into the combating piece, if there's any questions around definitions or clarity that I can provide.
First of all, folks are singing your praises in the chat, so thank you so much. Yes, you deserve that drink of water. Stay hydrated, please. Yes, this has been such a great presentation. Thank you for sharing the stories, the data, because I really, this is a part of my emotional intelligence training for myself. It's like, it's not all about the data and the numbers, it's about the storytelling as well. So I love that you're able to bring in, Maya Angelou and what Einstein thought of themselves, and to share that, because I think that can make just a more of a direct connection here. So Yes, folks are asking, are you going to be able to rewatch this chat? Yes, because I know that I know that Julia's dropping a lot of knowledge, and you might want to go back and take some notes. But I just want to flag some things that are coming up in the chat before we move on. So here we had Joseph Wright. I think the syndrome could be a buildup of gaslighting and end up feeling quite inferior. So it's interesting that you can make connections with burnout, gaslighting, nature versus nurture. I mean, it's so complex. And I remember just a couple years ago when folks started throwing this term out just more in the mainstream, there were some people that doubted that it even existed, imposter syndrome. And so I love that you're able to bring this research and data and, the story from your father and all that to just hold accountability there. So thank you so much. I would love to know if anyone wants to, use this opportunity to hop off mute. I know we got a lot of folks on the call. So if you do want to hop off mute, I just ask that you keep your question or reflection concise so that we can continue on with the questions and the presentation. So you can just let me know by raising your emoji hand. That will cue me to let me know that you want to hop off mute. Otherwise, continue dropping in the chat box. Everyone is just, reflecting with each other. So I appreciate that. Lynn writes, I also think society makes us feel that we have to struggle a lot to have big accomplishments. So if you get something great happens to you and your struggle doesn't match what people glorify, you feel like you didn't earn it. So do you want to comment on that or anything that's happening in the chat, Julia?
Yeah, ever since this term has been popularized, let's call it like 4 or 5 years ago, there's been this huge influx of, should I have imposter syndrome? Because I don't have it. I was moderating this group. It was this incredible group of female biotech founders, right? So not a lot of female founders in the biotech space. And we were talking about imposter syndrome, and some of the women said, I feel like I'm being told I should have imposter syndrome, but I don't have it, and I feel like that means there's something wrong with me. And that was such a beautiful point, right? 75% of us experience this. 25% of us don't, right? And there's nothing wrong with you if you don't experience it. I have seen a lot of the folks like, this isn't a thing. This is something that society tells women they have to experience. I have this really wonderful position as an executive coach where I can tell you that people experience this. This is real. This is men, this is women, this is across genders, across race. Yes, we have to do the work to separate out the systemic contributions, the company culture contributions to these feelings. And we also have work as individuals to do in managing these feelings.
Absolutely. I agree 1,000%. I love that you're highlighting, the systemic approach, which, I mean, historically speaking, we got a lot of work to do there, but also the individual approach. And just to relate this a little bit to the emotional intelligence research and training that I'm doing, self-awareness is key, right? So when you get to know what makes you feel comfortable, confident, that you're going with your purpose, discovering or rediscovering your purpose, it's easier to put those, those limits out, the boundary to protect yourself in essence, so that you can experience it less, let's say. So I can go on a rant there, but I see we got some folks with their emoji hands raised. So Tammy, I'm gonna give you permission here first, hop off mute. Go ahead, go for it.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted some clarification. If you doubted I know you're describing it as doubting an ability to overcome a knowledge gap, which stated recently. Yep. If your lack of confidence is only that, you don't have enough knowledge and you need more before you attempt something, when in reality you might have enough, but you don't trust that you have enough, and you over prepare for presentations and things like that because you don't want to make mistakes, more linked to perfectionism. How do you know if that's imposter syndrome?
Well, that sounds like imposter syndrome, because what you're saying is that you probably have the knowledge, but you're overworking to compensate for the fact that you feel like you don't. A great, how do I know if this is imposter syndrome or a knowledge gap? Engage a third party, right? We lack objectivity as individuals. And so sometimes it's hard to identify whether it's a knowledge gap or genuinely imposter syndrome. Who do you trust at work or in your personal life to give you that objective? I think you need to bolster this point a little bit. I think maybe you need to do some more research here, or you've got this. The only thing stopping you is you, right? So an objective perspective can be really helpful when you don't know if you're going overboard or not.
I love that. And actually, this is why I also ask for folks to start to network in the chat, because you know, you can do things like role playing, let's say role playing to prepare for an interview or to prepare for a presentation. And that, to your point, Julia, that gives an outside perspective of like, wait, you know, you went too deep. I think, you know, you're moving too quickly, or maybe it's not enough. And just having that support and someone to help you fall back on, you know, something that just helped you shine and made you feel comfortable in that moment. So again, I'm just going to shout out in the chat box. Lots of folks are dropping ways to connect. Feel free to connect with people. And like I said, you have full permission, since this is, you know, speaking specifically about how to combat or how to, you know, kick imposter syndrome in the ass. Reach out to them specifically regarding this topic and say, you know, I have a big presentation coming up. All that we were on the same chat. Do you mind if, you know, we role play a little bit? Like, and, you know, of course, respect each other's time, respect each other's perspective, and see what happens. I love this. All right, Honey, you are up next on my list. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, great. So thank you for the information. It's the first time I'm attending this, and very informative in terms of the you know, imposter syndrome. Again, doesn't really get discussed much. I do have multiple questions, and cut me off if you think I'm taking too much time. I would say one thing in the military, I would say I've seen the big time in terms of imposter syndrome supported to be developed. So kind of like the whole, you know, fake it till you make it type stuff. So which I think adds to the base of the future for the imposter syndrome to be developed. So, and you know, love to hear your thoughts on it. The other thing I have is, do you think that the leadership is at some sort of a failure for not ensuring that the employees don't develop that imposter syndrome? Because, you know, we tend to focus on employees that tend to be a little overconfident because they happen to be the number one in the team or something, and some people accept that place well, others kind of use it. So I think the leadership has some function in there to ensure that the imposter syndrome is not being developed, because then you lose efficiency. So, and the last thing is, okay, social charms and everything, that's the part I don't agree with, because some people just go to work. They're not going there to find out whose kid likes what color, what football, what baseball, basketball, you know. I mean, it's a lot of information overload. So to me, that is not necessarily a part of employment. And I know that might be my introvert speaking, but it adds a lot more confusion to it, because you end up with the individuals that like I had a supervisor one time, he had a very big time halo effect. So whatever happened last event is how he judged you for the entire time for your performance. So, you know, so to me, that's kind of a thing where it's people take advantage of that stuff. So it's good that the imposter syndrome is recognized, but I don't think it's the leadership. And I'm talking about leadership in vice president, CEO type levels and stuff. They don't know this, and they haven't developed policies to ensure that this doesn't happen or this gets, you know, minimized. So just, you know, my thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Honey. Those are great questions. So I'll take one by one. The first one is fake it till you make it. How does that's something that's touted as a good thing, right? Like, well, if you don't know what you're doing, just fake it till you make it. And that's a good thing. What does that have to do with imposter syndrome? So I propose a rebrand of fake it till you make it, which is have faith in your ability to learn and get caught up until you see success, and don't hide the fact that you don't know the answers to questions. Fake it till you make it, when people truly hide that they don't know, contributes to cultures where people answer questions that they don't know the answer to, which can lead to harmful business results. It contributes to feelings of imposter syndrome because you feel like everyone around you knows what they're doing, even when they don't. And so I actually, yes, saying you don't know is okay. I just saw that pop up in the chat. That'll come later in my presentation, right? I don't know is a full sentence. It's like, let's normalize gaps in our knowledge, and let's normalize the process of learning and having faith and confidence in our ability to learn and get caught up, which doesn't mean that you're less than in the moment if you don't know the answer. So that's how I would answer the fake it till you make it. I'm not a fan of fake it till you make it. Your second question is about leadership. So listen, I've seen companies have company-wide conversations about imposter syndrome spearheaded by leadership. I've seen companies where they bring this as a well-known phenomenon into group culture. They talk about it, they integrate it. I think because the concept itself makes us feel alone and shrouded in secrecy, even if executive leaders have experienced it, they think other people haven't experienced it, and that it makes us weak to talk about. And so one activity I like to do if you're a manager of other people or you lead other people is in team meetings, when you start, go around the room and ask everyone to ask a question. Start there. Normalize having questions. Normalize people in senior leadership positions having questions, and just answer those questions or sit with those questions, but make asking questions normal, not immediately having answers normal. So that's the way that I like to tackle that. And then Marielle and Marie, do you want to say anything about the third one?
Oh my
I
goodness.
want to make sure I understood that.
Yes, no, I love your responses to the first two. Essentially, I mean, this is a really big chewy topic that I love cracking open. Essentially, we're asking to stop these social norms of, for example, fake it till you make it, which is, in my opinion, a part of the colonized mindset. It doesn't allow for diversity of thought. It doesn't allow for people to bring their authentic selves. You have to try to fit into this mold of what is right, what is acceptable. The great thing is that times are changing, and we have, more people like us who want to challenge that norm and normalize asking questions. So thank you so much for highlighting that. For the social charms question, I think that I think that, honey, I think you're saying it's more of your personal view, and I think a key word there is that you said it was that maybe because you're an introvert. So maybe I can reframe that question. How can introverts who might feel uncomfortable with, the normality of social charming in the workplace, not let that affect them, so that they don't think that they need to try to, and it's hard because we're on social media and like, it's become a norm on social media to do this like social charming thing. So can I reframe it that way?
Yeah, okay, I think that's a great reframe. Yeah, so when I talked about social charm, I talked about that as a behavior that many people with imposter syndrome engage in to help overcome discomfort of feelings of imposter syndrome. So social charm is by no means a mandatory part of being a good colleague or being good at work. So I think let's be clear that this is like a coping mechanism for imposter syndrome for some, but not for all. You might have very different coping mechanisms that look normal to you. But I hope that answers that question.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, honey. I know you had a couple questions there, but they were all great, thoughtful, and I appreciate you. We gave you some extra time there. I appreciate your questions. All right, so we've got about 20 minutes left. Do you want to represent and go over some things before we roll into more questions?
Yes, let's talk about ways to combat this. Let's move into that. So I've got 8 ways to start to think about combating imposter syndrome. And I think the thing to note here is that these are all going to be practices. I wish I could give you a little white pill and make you get rid of your imposter syndrome forever. Believe me, I have fantasized about taking that pill. This won't be that, but this will be things for us to talk about. So the first most well-documented in the research way to combat imposter syndrome is to talk about it like we're doing right now and to get vulnerable. The reason this works is because imposter syndrome, as I've mentioned a couple of times, becomes so insidious when it's a dirty secret that we carry around. When we can blow it up and understand that other people who we think are accomplished and succeeding also experience these feelings, it can normalize it and lessen it for us. So I think maybe we can either share, Marielle, Marie, I'll leave it to you. If folks want to share the first time they experienced imposter syndrome and what it looked like, how you still experience it today, I think that could be a really powerful exercise.
Absolutely. So let's see if anyone wants to just briefly go into those points. You are welcome to drop those in the chat. Or if someone wants to courageously hop off mute and share vocally, just raise your emoji hand and let us know. So what are the questions again, Julia?
Yeah, so you can either answer, when is the first time you experienced imposter syndrome, even if you didn't know what to call it, or how do you still experience it today?
So just to fill in, as folks are thinking of if they want to come off mute or write in the chat, I would just automatically, I don't have a clear memory of it, but I think it probably happened during school, you know, just the pressure of like having to stand up and I consider myself an extrovert. I studied theater and film. So I was even comfortable doing that. But even then it's like, oh, I don't know, I have to speak about this topic that they just told me to memorize for a standardized test. You know, it just gets really shady at a certain point, the way that we're expected to, you know things in the education system, at least. Elementary school, someone writes, yes. Okay, so I'm just gonna read some things in the chat. So we've got first time was probably junior high or high school. Let's see here. I first experienced it when I got my first job as a developer and I was the only woman on the team. I remember thinking, what the hell am I doing here? But you're not alone in that. Someone else writes, since elementary school, being bullied. Someone else writes, just ended a 34-year career in a job where I felt it almost all the time. Now I'm doing a career pivot and I'm feeling it due to a new direction, less knowledge, older. Okay, so that person is feeling the imposter syndrome because they're making a career pivot. Let's see here, what else here? I don't remember never feeling it also. Okay, never, gosh, this is, okay, so I think we've got enough to talk about already. Continue dropping things in the chat box, folks. Julia, would you like to comment on any of these?
Thank you guys for being so vulnerable and sharing these answers. I think what you're all describing are things that I see really frequently, which is origins in school in a testing environment, having it rear its head when you're starting something new, whether it's a new project or a new job, feeling like you always experience it no matter what's going on. So these are all common things. So how does it feel to share this in this group? I know we're typing, but what does it feel like to get a little vulnerable and to see the people, hundreds of people on this Zoom talking about this so publicly?
I love it. It makes my heart feel full, just because we aren't given the space. And to Honey's point, I know that, Julia, you have seen leadership talk about this, but I guess because it's not a norm or it doesn't happen so often, to Honey's point, leadership definitely has a lot of work to do. And I see that being brought up, you know, a lot in conversations. So speaking specifically to leadership, I mean, you know, I love that you were like normalized question asking. What's something else? What's another, you know, thing to make this like less heavy, less of a burden so that it can be, you know, worked through in a holistic way?
Yeah, so I think that's a great like prompt to go back to the presentation so we can talk about some strategies here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So we just did the first one, which is talk about it and get vulnerable. Okay, the second one here is really big. It's about internal work, about unlinking failure with shame. And so what does that mean? That means you're moving from an identity, which is I am bad, I am a failure because I didn't perform as I wanted to on this thing, to I feel like I could have done better. I feel like this is what I will do differently next time, right? So when we conflate mistakes with identity and our worthiness as human beings to exist, that can lead to greater feelings of imposter syndrome. When we think about failure or something that didn't go right, which is how I prefer to say it, as just a feeling or a single moment that doesn't equate to our identity in any way, that can lessen feelings of imposter syndrome. I also like to say perfect is a fake word. It's a fake concept. Perfect is completely subjective. There's no such thing as perfect. And so the sooner we can internalize that idea, the better off we'll be.
Can I chime in, Julia? I love this acronym for FAIL. First attempt in learning. FAIL. First attempt in learning. Doesn't that just like crack it open a little more? It's like, okay, instead of just like doing this like shameful response to feeling like you have failed, it's like, actually I'm learning and there's a learning curve. And if I just embody that, I'm forever learning and I will never stop learning. I also want to demystify like the word expert, because I feel like, you know, we're all human and maybe we decided to spend 20 years learning something, but you know, I don't know. I would love to demystify that as well.
Yeah, I love that. First attempt in learning. I'm writing that down and realizing it. Yes. Yeah, we're just like blowing up all of these words that are just like in our normal lexicon, which I'm such a fan of. Yes. Thank you for that piece of wisdom. Let's talk about highlight reels. I've seen some questions and some comments in the chat about comparing to others and jealousy to others. that can absolutely contribute to feelings of imposter syndrome. And so there's this, I'm going to explain what that picture is. It requires some context. Okay, so when I was in high school, I was like a smart kid who would also pass notes in the back. And me and my best friend would pass notes and draw little illustrations. And there was this popular girl. You know her. She was on varsity tennis. She somehow had the like cutest little body. She was in all AP classes, so smart. All of the boys, older boys, wanted her. And it just seemed effortless. And so my friend happened to keep all of our doodles from high school. This is a literal picture that we drew of her in English class, taking a poop that is perfect cubes. I'm kidding, I'm not kidding. Perfectly feathered hair, mathematically perfect poop cubes. She's pooping butterflies. So what I want to describe right now is this idea that we ascribe perfection onto other people without knowing their back end process. What actually was happening with her, which happens with anyone that we think is perfect, is what's called the swan effect, which is you have this beautiful image on the top of the water of this gorgeous, effortless, perfect swan. But guess what's happening under the water? Frantic, paddling, not okay, right? That's hidden from view. And so what we see is the highlight reel, the swan, the perfect poop cubes, right? And so how are you swan affecting the people who you're putting on a pedestal of being perfect and having their shit together? So being mindful about highlight reels, I highly recommend Googling famous people fail stories. It's a very therapeutic way to remind yourself that all famous accomplished people have had really bad ruts and they didn't immediately find success. Keep a smile file. Does anyone already do this? I want to hear in the chat if you do this. So here's what a smile file is. It can be a diary, it can be a Google Drive, anything you want where you document positive things that happen for you at work or in your personal life. Positive things people have said to you, accolades you've gotten, to remind yourself that when those feelings of imposter syndrome creep in, it isn't black or white. It isn't, I've never known what I'm doing and I'm all bad and I never knew anything. It's, I have this feeling, let me pull up my smile file and remind myself of the data, right? Imposter syndrome says, despite data that says we're successful otherwise, here's your opportunity to document that data. Ask friends and colleagues to contribute, right? It doesn't just have to be you. So where are you turning to remind yourself of your achievements? We talked about this already, but worth kind of revisiting, getting comfortable with this phrase. It's okay to not know things. It's actually beautiful to not know things. And we're going to talk about why. But here's what happens. So this is one of my favorite quotes. I was gratified to be able to answer the question quickly. I said, I don't know. Mark Twain. We should all aspire to be Mark Twain. So here's what happens. This is a cycle when we don't say, I don't know. When we fear being seen as an imposter, what we do is we tend to hide mistakes in our gaps in our knowledge, right? So this might be answering questions right away, pretending we know the answer, ignoring it. What happens when we do that is we don't ask questions. We don't seek support because we're hiding it. What happens then is we sabotage our chance to learn and actually become more knowledgeable about that thing. And when we sabotage those chances and we don't learn, we fear being seen as an imposter and the whole thing starts again. So when we acknowledge not knowing, we actually break this cycle and we get the opportunity to learn. Okay, number 6. Here's the thing about imposter syndrome. It's such an intense focus on us, right? It's me, I'm gonna fail, I don't know, I'm faking it, everyone's gonna find me out. So one really helpful way to cope is to focus externally. And one way that we know that's actually one of the best ways to gain self-esteem is to provide value to other people. So counterintuitively, one of the strategies is not focusing inward, it's actually focusing outward. So how can you genuinely help someone else? I love the group therapy example, which is, why is group therapy effective? Group therapy isn't effective because of a one-on-one relationship with the therapist and each person in the group. Group therapy is effective because of the group dynamic, because people are sharing their experiences in service of the other people in the group. It bolsters self-esteem, it makes people feel less alone. That's why it works. So we're applying that same methodology here. So what are ways to help other people? And I'm sure you guys, please add more in the chat, whatever I'm missing. Skills-based volunteering. So taking something you're good at and doing it on a volunteer basis. So I will volunteer to coach low-income entrepreneurs. That's something that I love, right? I'm a coach. I can do this for people who wouldn't be able to afford it. That's really gratifying to me. Join a board of a nonprofit. What are causes you care about? How can you volunteer your time? Offer a teammate help, right? This doesn't have to be like a big extracurricular. This can be, my teammate doesn't know this thing that I know, let me go help. This can help decrease feelings of imposter syndrome when we provide value. Okay, 7, and this is a big one. So I'm a big fan when I coach people of whatever you're feeling, whatever you're experiencing is data. Data, it's a signal. What is it telling us? This is beautiful, it's telling us something. What is it telling us, right? How can we interpret your imposter syndrome as a signal? So first, anticipate your imposter syndrome. I had someone ask a question of how do I anticipate my imposter syndrome? You gotta get intentional. You gotta sit with your bad self. You gotta say, when are the times that I've experienced this? When am I gonna have those experiences again in the near future? So you might say, it's when I started this new project. It's when I started this new job. It's when I'm giving a brand new presentation in front of 3,000 people. It's public speaking, right? Know when it's gonna come. And then you're able to ask the question, this means I need. I'm gonna feel imposter syndrome, so this means I'm going to need. You have the power to help yourself, right? You're gonna know what makes you feel better. I know for me, this means I need 10 minutes to sit and breathe from my diaphragm. That's what helps me. For other people, it's calling a friend and saying, hey, I'm panicking, and having the friend talk you off the ledge, right? Only you know what you need. Only you know what this is a signal of. And that's a really rich opportunity for some introspection. Number 8, and the final one, because we're talking about systems, spearhead a conversation about imposter syndrome at work. Take what we're talking about here, find some trusted colleagues, and engage in conversations about this. Engage your leaders in conversations about imposter syndrome to normalize it in the workplace. Figure out who you can trust. We can talk about that if that doesn't feel like an obvious thing or person right now. And this is also a great opportunity to have discussions around, what does professional mean at our company? What is leadership saying in terms of what we should look like or sound like, and how might that affect imposter syndrome? So I want to really encourage you, now that we've done this work on yourself, to take this to the next level, to your companies and the systems that might make this concept more pervasive than it needs to be. Okay. This is a practice, not a pill. Just reminding you, these are all things to embody. And then this is me. And before we get to questions, I just want to remind Marielle and Marie that I have a freebie for you guys. It is the Authenticity Guide, which is one of the tools that I use for my coaching clients. You can download that for free at the link that Marielle and Marie is going to share in the chat. Yes.
Awesome. I just dropped it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. I wish we had more time. I'm looking forward to connecting with you after this conversation, because such a beautiful holistic vision of this, really overwhelming conversation of, how do we even identify within ourselves? How do we move that into, our communities, our workplace? So I love that you just have this, the intentionality of getting through this, and that you can, start to help yourself first, and also reach out to people who you think, can give you that real perspective as well. So that third eye view. And so a third eye view, I didn't mean to say that, but you know what I mean? Yes, that conscious perspective. That's the second pair of eyes is what I meant to say. All right, so we've got about 4 minutes left. You've dropped so much knowledge already. I really appreciate you. Can you leave us with some food for thought? I mean, again, you've already dropped so many gems throughout this hour, but what is something that you want people to remember as soon as we end this conversation? What can they start doing right now when this conversation ends, given that we are clearly, you know, all dealing with imposter syndrome at some, you know, on the spectrum at some point, whether we are dealing with it now or whether we can anticipate that, you know, maybe this can happen based on, you know, maybe I want to do a career pivot, or maybe I want to move to another place, or maybe, you know, I want to do something in my community, volunteer. I mean, there's so many things that can initiate that. Can you share some food for thought before we end this conversation?
Yeah, so I'm going to leave you with the prompt that I use internally in my mind that I encourage my clients to use. And it's an exercise that you can use whenever you're feeling distraught, having negative thoughts. And it can be really powerful. And so I'll leave you with this prompt, and it is this. If I were to use a lens of radical self-compassion, here is how this thought would change. The reason why self-compassion is because we often lack it. And I don't believe that anything good comes of punishing ourselves or negative self-talk. And I want you to see what happens when you shift your thinking to use a lens of radical self-compassion, radical kindness towards yourself. And I think that's a really great note to end on, particularly we are tired, we are burnt out, we are zoomed out. The more self-compassion you can give yourself, the greater the gift.
I'm going to probe you a little bit because we do have some extra time. For that big C word, compassion, that might seem really out of reach for someone. It might seem really woo-wooey or really, you know, not so important in the list of priorities because I got to do X, Y, Z, and I got to feed this and I got to do this and that. How can you demystify giving yourself compassion? What's like one, you know, active step to doing that?
Think about someone other than yourself who you feel unconditional love and compassion for. So for some people, it's easy to access love for a pet, love for a child, a niece or nephew, someone who you would never tell is doing a horrible job and deserves to be fired, right? So first find your compassion for that person, find that language, and then turn that towards yourself.
I love that. Simple, but huge and so necessary with all of the changes that are going on in the world. You know, all of the inner work that we have to do. Somebody might be like, you know, why was I born in this time? I got so much work to do on myself. But guess what? You know, our ancestors went through a lot. We need to honor them by working on ourselves and hopefully, you know, just be the change that we want to see. And we can totally do this in the workplace. You know, I don't believe that we have to check certain things at the door that they used to, you know, in other generations. I think that it calls for more mindful conversations, you know, more meaningful connections. And there's just so much noise happening in general that it's, you know, anticipate. I love that anticipation that you highlighted before. Anticipate that some of those things might trigger imposter syndrome. And how we can just try to avoid that. So thank you so much, Julia. I really appreciate you sharing time with us today. And just verbally out loud, how can people connect with you? I've dropped the link in the chat box a couple of times to find out more about what you're offering, but just verbally for folks who might be rewatching this later and don't have access to the chat, what's the best way to connect with you?
Yes, so follow me on LinkedIn. My name is Julia Wuench at LinkedIn. You can follow me or connect with me. Just add a note that you were at the session. Go to my website, www.theauthenticityguide.com. Follow The Authenticity Guide on Instagram. And I want to just give a final shout out and thank you to Mariella Marie, who moderated this beautifully and kept us all organized and together and was dynamic and engaging to boot. So thank you for being my partner in this.
Thank you, Julia. And thank you everyone else who's joined this conversation. Good luck. Can make those connections that you all have made in the chat box. Reach out to Julia, reach out to me. We're here to support you and take care. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll see you next week. I can't believe it's Friday.